Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On paper, Russia is doing surprisingly well on its own backyard. Trade with former Soviet Republic has surged since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, nearly doubling in just 4 years. If you look only at the numbers, you might conclude that Moscow has weathered a geopolitical storm and quietly reasserted itself across the post-Soviet space. But influence is not measured in customs data, and the more closely you examine this trade boom, the clearer it becomes that it reflects not Russia's strength, but its constraints, and a temporary arrangement that could unravel the moment the war ends. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia has long extended political and economic influence over the post-Soviet sphere, particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine brought into question whether these post-Soviet states would seek to distance themselves from Moscow, especially as China pushes to assert itself as a regional superpower. Many post-Soviet states have taken an ambiguous path when it comes to relations with Russia, at times maintaining friendlier ties with Moscow and at times not. While some have attempted to distance themselves politically from Moscow, they largely continue to grow closer economically. Total Russian trade turnover with all post-Soviet states went from $63 billion in 2020 to $125 billion in 2023. The Kremlin has been particularly interested in maintaining positive economic ties with these countries as a means of compensating for Western sanctions and their economic depressing effect. For some, economic cooperation and trade with Russia have grown at phenomenal rates. Armenia is one such country, with bilateral trade jumping from $2.3 billion in 2020 to $12 billion in 2024. The small Central Asian state of Kyrgyzstan ranks second in trade growth with Russia, with bilateral trade jumping from $2.4 billion in 2021 to $3.9 billion in 2024. Despite attempts from some of Russia's post-Soviet allies to politically distance themselves from Moscow, trade relations have proven to be an area of growth. While the Kremlin continues to look for means to evade Western sanctions, the economic opportunity for many may simply be too good to pass up.
And now, let's zone in on the East planning portion of our show. While Moscow expected its war against Ukraine to reassert political dominance over the former Soviet space, analysts say that the effect has been quite the opposite. While it may be lucrative for some former Soviet states to engage Russia through trade, many don't want to be dragged into the downward political spiral that has isolated Russia for many years. So, what do Moscow's relation in the former Soviet sphere look like? As always, here's a closer look.
Experts warn that Russia's preoccupation with the war in Ukraine, now stretching into its fourth year, has caused countries that previously were solidly within the Kremlin sphere of influence to drift away. For those wishing to maintain positive relations with the West, becoming politically engrossed with Russia is viewed as a problematic strategy. Moreover, the Kremlin's inability to fulfill its military objectives on the Ukrainian front line has signaled that the Russian armed forces are not as powerful as once assumed. Moscow's image as a key regional superpower has eroded, despite long touting the strength of the Russian army. Russia's political sidelining has been seen across post-Soviet states. In the Caucasus, where Russia has long sent peacekeeping troops over conflicts in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, Armenia and Azerbaijan reached their August 2025 peace deal with U.S. brokering. Despite warm relations with Moscow, Kazakhstan has avoided recognizing Russia's illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory and maintains positive relations with the West. The Kremlin's fixation on the war in Ukraine has caused countries in the post-Soviet sphere to rethink their relations with Moscow. The longer war drags on, the more likely these countries are to find alternative political partners.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. So one of the persistent analytical traps in covering Russia's neighborhood is the assumption that economic gravity automatically translates into political control. For decades, that logic mostly held. Russia dominated trade, energy, labor markets, and security across the former Soviet space, and political alignment followed. What has changed since 2022 is the meaning of that trade for Moscow. Russia's growing trade with former Soviet Republic is not a sign of renewed integration. It is a byproduct of isolation. Cut off from large parts of the global economy, Moscow has been forced to rely on its neighbor as intermediaries, logistical buffers that help sanctions goods flow into Russia under different flags and paperwork. Now, this distinction matters. Re-export trade is transactional. There's nothing strategic about it. It creates volume and revenue, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of politics. Armenia's dramatic increase in trade with Russia illustrates this perfectly. Yerevan quintupled its bilateral trade while simultaneously drifting further away from Moscow politically, freezing security cooperation and openly questioning Russia's reliability as an ally. In a traditional imperial model, that combination would be unthinkable. But as of right now, it is routine. The same pattern appears across Central Asia and South Caucasus, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, profit from re-export flows while carefully hedging their foreign policies. Azerbaijan allows trade to grow even as relations with Moscow deteriorate into open tension. Kazakhstan increases commerce but resists political alignment and strengthens ties with China, Turkey, and the West. Trade has become completely decoupled from obedience. For Russia's neighbors, re-export trade is a low-commitment opportunity created by sanctions. It brings customs, revenues, jobs, and leverage, but it does not require ideological alignment or long-term dependence. In fact, it incentivizes diversification. See, the more these states act as intermediaries rather than partners, the easier it becomes to imagine a post-Russia future. For Moscow, on the one hand, it keeps goods flowing and softens the impact of sanctions. On the other, it reinforces a humiliating reality. Russia increasingly depends on countries it once dominated. When the war in Ukraine eventually ends and sanctions ease, whether partially or fully, the logic of this trade will collapse. Russia will no longer need intermediaries to import consumer goods, machinery, or electronics. And that is where the political risk lies. For many post-Soviet states, today's high trade figures mask a future shock. Businesses built around re-export will struggle. Governments will have to explain why economic ties with Russia suddenly shrank and whether replacing them with China, Turkey, or the West is feasible. Raising trade figures may look like resilience, but in reality, they mark a transitional phase. And transitions in this region have rarely ended quietly. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow from Jamestown Foundation. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So today we are trying to explore the deteriorating relation between Russia and some of the post-Soviet countries while somehow still maintaining trade. One of the things I read on your recent article titled Russian deepens trade with post-Soviet countries while their influence is waning. And I'm hoping it can help us kind of put two and two together because it does seem a little bit counterintuitive on the surface level.
Well, many people assume that the level of trade between countries necessarily provides an unfailing accurate indication of the level of influence and trust they have. But it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes trade will increase for reasons that have nothing to do with influence. And sometimes, in fact, the trade may create a situation in which each side will have more sense that it can act on its own because the other side has no choice but to continue to trade with it. Russia's trade with the former Soviet republics has increased in all cases except, of course, the three Baltic countries, which were in a different status, and in Moldova, which has moved away from Russia because of the war in Ukraine. What is going on is this. Russia cannot trade with many parts of the world because of Western sanctions. Consequently, it's trading more with the former Soviet republics. And much of that trade, much of it, not all of it, but much of that trade is re-exporting by those countries to Russia. In other words, this is a bypassing of the sanctions regime. So if you look at it just very superficially, it appears that Russia is building a base for expanding influence again. That could be the case if Russia were to change course radically, and if these countries were able to provide the kind of goods and services and raw materials that Russia wants, once it doesn't have to rely on them as re-exporters of cargo from elsewhere.
Right, like you mentioned, trade does not necessarily means influence or a good relationship. But from a geopolitical standpoint, do you think that that is in favor or in a disadvantage for using economic tools as of a form of diplomatic isolation?
Well, there are lots of kinds of economic tools, and they are introduced in various ways and with various degrees of success. The idea of Western sanctions was that no one would trade with Russia. But in fact, there were a lot of countries who were quite prepared to serve as re exporters of goods, in other words, importing goods that they could legally acquire, despite the sanctions regime on Russia, and then sell them on to Russia. A lot of these countries saw that as a way of making money, but it isn't a long term proposition. Presumably, sanctions will at some point end or at least be reduced in size. When that happens, the question remains, will those countries be able to fill in the gap that will emerge as Russia no longer has to seek re exporting through them, but can go directly to the countries that produce the goods or mine the minerals that it wants? My guess is that a few of them will be able to do that, but most will not. And so what will happen is you're going to see not the expanded trade of the sanctions period, providing a basis for the expansion of Russian influence, but rather a collapse of the trade that will then become the basis for less good relations between Moscow and the former Soviet republics.
Is there an argument to be made that these not long-term, but short-term trade relations that are established, be it the contracts or even the trade logistic that has been established during these few years, might actually serve as a basis of increased trade relations even after the sanctions are lifted?
Well, it could, but it would only be if the Russian government decided that it was more important to rely on these continuing re-exporting arrangements than to go to the original source of those goods and raw materials. My guess is that most Russian companies and the Kremlin would elect to go direct because they're paying a premium for the re-export arrangements. Let's say that something goes from the Middle East to Kazakhstan and then goes on to Russia. You can be sure that the Kazakhs are charging something extra as that happens, and most Russian businessmen and the Russian government too will want to go directly to the Middle East for these goods and services and cargo, and Kazakhstan will be cut out. Could Moscow make a decision to continue to pay those bonuses to these countries as a price of increasing its influence? Sure. Is that likely? I don't think so, especially if we're going into a period where the Russian economy is either not growing or in fact is contracting, and so that people will be unwilling to give up any benefit they can get from lowering the prices by changing the direction of trade.
And do you think that is a good argument to say that the sanctions that's been applied on Russia is working as intended, and that perhaps a lot of the secondary sanctions that people are pushing for is not exactly as urgent, perhaps, as a lot of people have perceived it to be?
Well, the question is, what did we expect the sanctions to do? If the idea was that the sanctions would cause Russians to suffer, and therefore the Russian government would change the policies that Western countries didn't like, that hasn't worked. I mean, Russia is still engaged in a massive war in Ukraine. The sanctions haven't stopped that. If we did it because we wanted to feel morally superior, because we were doing something when we weren't doing other kinds of things that we might have done, that certainly worked, although not perhaps as was explicitly intended. I think that making it more difficult for the Russian economy to function is a long-term proposition. The tendency in Western countries in particular is to think in very short term. In other words, we introduced these sanctions a year or 8 years ago and nothing has happened. Well, if you really want the sanctions to bite, it's going to take a very long time, and you're going to have to engage in punishing re-exporters of sanctioned goods too. So those are things that weren't thought about very, very carefully before sanctions were introduced, because the assumption was that if we put these sanctions in, given that we're doing it gradually, then Russia will change its course because it can't afford to live with the sanctions regime. What the re-export arrangements that Russia has made with the former Soviet republics and other countries, to be sure, shows is that the sanctions regime by itself isn't going to deprive Russia of everything it wants from the international economy, and that the sanctions aren't going to lead to a change in Russian policy, at least any time as quickly and effectively as many in the West have thought.
Right. On the other end, I would like to come back to our original topic about how trade relations are still booming even under the political deterioration, and pointing to some of the examples like Armenia and Azerbaijan. Can you help us paint a picture of how their deteriorating political relation between them and Russia has not really contributed to a downward trend in trade, but the opposite?
Well, the trade has increased. Armenia is desperate to sell on goods. 80% of the goods that Armenia sells to Russia are re-exports passing around the sanctions regime. In Azerbaijan, that percentage is much lower, but it's still higher than you might expect. These countries need the trade. They need the money that it provides. And this is one of the quick ways they can get it. That doesn't mean that there aren't a whole lot of things in both cases, which mean these countries are very, very unhappy with Moscow's policies. The Armenians still cannot forgive the Russians for not intervening as promised to defend the position of ethnic Armenians in Karabakh, or to prevent Azerbaijan's restoration of control over its territories. The Azerbaijanis have an even longer list of complaints, the shooting down of an Azerbaijani civilian airliner, the killing of Azerbaijani activists inside the Russian Federation, and so on. So there are lots of reasons that you would expect these countries' relationships with Russia to deteriorate. But given their economic situations, you can also see why, with a carefully designed marketing effort, Moscow has been able to increase trade with these countries over the last 4 or 5 years, something that many people did not expect, and that means that the sanctions regime is going to take even longer to work because of it.
Right. So, yeah, it definitely seems very paradoxical on the surface, but thank you so much for helping us unpack the logic behind all of that. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Russian forces appear to be preparing to withdraw from the Kamishli air base in northern Syria, a facility that has long supported Moscow's military presence near the Turkish border.
Recent footage shows Russian personnel loading aircraft, vehicles and other equipment onto transport planes, suggesting a coordinated redeployment of both air and ground assets to other positions inside Syria. The apparent pullback comes amid shifting control dynamics in the northeast of the country following a January ceasefire between the Syrian government and Kurdish-led forces, which returned large territories to Damascus's control. Syrian officials have reportedly discussed asking Russia to vacate the base altogether. While neither Moscow nor Damascus has confirmed a withdrawal, the activity points to a possible recalibration of Russia's footprint in the region.
The Council of the European Union has approved a phased ban on Russian liquefied natural gas and pipeline gas, marking a major step towards ending the bloc's dependence on Russian fossil fuels.
Under the plan, restrictions will begin 6 weeks after the regulation enters into force, with a full ban on Russian LNG imports set for early 2027, followed by a pipeline gas ban later that year. EU member states will be required to verify the origin of gas imports and submit national diversification plans by March 2026, with steep fines for violations. While the EU has already cut Russian gas imports sharply since 2021, it remains Moscow's largest buyer, particularly of LNG.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.